Elderly black man is humiliated by racist police officers, but the next day they beg for mercy.
If you're new to this channel, I invite you to click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any amazing new stories here. Adam, a black-skinned man showing signs of time and life's hardships, walked slowly but determinedly through the busy streets of the city center. His eyes, though tired, still had the sparkle of someone who has been through a lot. He was a retired police colonel. He got this job after many years of effort. He had faced problems in a system that didn't always respect his color or his roots. But that afternoon, as he looked at the watches, he wasn't just thinking about how much they were worth. For him, those objects meant something much more important: the ability to control his own future. Adam had never liked expensive things, but after so long serving in the army, he felt he deserved something to show off his achievements. I thought about buying him a watch as a reminder that, even with everything, he was still in control of his time and his life. Two security guards, who were wearing very nice uniforms, approached calmly. "Hi, what are you doing there?" one of them asked, with a contemptuous manner. There was no kindness in his voice. There was just the desire to show that they had power over this man. Adam, maintaining the calm he had learned over many years of work, kept his eyes on the place. He knew that situations like that happened a lot, but they were never acceptable. He replied calmly, "I'm looking at watches. I'm thinking of buying one of them." Adam's answer, clear and direct, seemed almost like a challenge to the security guards. They laughed. The laughter sounded like a sharp knife. The smile wasn't funny, but mean. For them to think that this man could buy one of the expensive watches in the shop window was a very strange idea. "You buy one of those?" one of them repeated, laughing as if Adam had told a joke. "You don't even have enough money to buy a pair of slippers." Those words hurt Adam like a knife. It wasn't just about money. It was also about the obvious lack of respect and the hidden racism that had always been part of his life. "Who are you to tell me what I can and can't buy?" she said, her voice louder and more certain. Her eyes, which had been calm before, now shone like those of someone who can't accept being treated with less respect than she deserves. He looked the security guards in the eye. And at that moment, it seemed that all the injustice he had ever experienced in his life came back at once. The security guards, seeing that Adam was not a man to be frightened by provocation, took action. His look changed from laughing at others to disliking them. They moved closer, entering Adam's space like animals near their food. "Mate, turn it down. You don't own the place," one of them said, pushing him a little with his chest. Adam, who had spent his life controlling fighting situations, once again felt the urge to defend himself. He wasn't just an old man in a watch store. In that instant, he once again became the colonel who had already had a much more difficult time than being cursed at by two uneducated men. However, the situation of his age and the racist society weighed heavily on him. One false step could change your life forever. The security guards were prepared to cause more trouble. They didn't care about the truth or who Adam really was. To them, he didn't deserve respect. This was a chance to show that they had power over someone they thought was less important. The loud sound of their words began to attract the attention of other people passing by. But the security guards didn't leave. They understood that most of the time, people like Adam received no help from a society that often left them out. People were starting to gather. People curiously looked on helplessly, as if they were watching a boring show. It was Adam's humiliation. He was a man who had worked hard for many years, yet they treated him as if he didn't matter, as if he were invisible. It was even sadder to think that they saw him only as a problem to be solved. "You think you can talk to us like that, man?" One of the security guards was annoying him and lightly pushing his chest. The act, which seemed small, was a sign of the lack of respect they had for Adam. Adam tried to stay calm. He took a deep breath, but the anger burned in his chest like a fire he couldn't put out. He knew he couldn't let those men treat him like this. "You can't treat me like this!" Adam raised his voice. The sound of it was strong and full of certainty. The years he had been in charge came to the fore. His attitude didn't show that he was someone defeated. He was a man who knew he deserved respect, no matter what the situation. But his voice, so strong and full of stories, couldn't stop the security guards. They came closer. The surrounding crowd could hardly breathe. One of the security guards flashed an evil smile and said, "Old man, don't tell us what we can and can't do." And then, with a strong shove, they pushed at him again, causing him to fall. His body, tired by the years, didn't move as quickly as it had before.
so he fell to the ground with a muffled sound. The pain in his body was much less than the pain in his heart that he felt at that moment. Adam's fall was an instant that stopped time. In that moment, it became clear how wounded society is. Racism and the lack of respect for black lives came through loud and clear. There, on the ground, Adam wasn't just an older man. He showed many years of injustice that many people like him have experienced. The crowd watched in silence. They were part of a society that often chooses not to see what is happening around them. But Adam, even in a difficult situation, was not a man without hope. He understood that there was something more important going on there. It wasn't just about him, his pride or his honor. It was about a whole system that was trying to hurt people just like him. He wouldn't let that happen. With dedication, he began to stand. The pain in his leg and back hurt a lot, but his will to keep going was greater. Adam would not be defeated by a push or an affront. As he stood up, looking at the security guards, the crowd around him began to speak quietly, as if something inside them realized that there was injustice in what was happening, but no one had the courage to say anything yet. Adam, now standing, looked directly at the men who had made him fall. "I'm not just anyone," he said, with a calmness that hid the confusion he felt inside, "and you're going to have to bear the consequences of that." The security guards, noticing that Adam would not be easily frightened, began to get angry. The man's bold attitude was making them angry. They wanted to humiliate him even more. But what they didn't know was that, in that instant, the situation was about to change in a way they could never have imagined. Adam wasn't just an ordinary person. He had been a police colonel. His experience, authority, and respect were about to be noticed. Adam, even though he was injured, knew he couldn't go back. His experience in the police and the discipline of a lifetime dedicated to public service had taught him never to bow down to injustice. His pride and honesty were at stake here. "Mate, you'd better leave before the situation gets really bad," one of the security guards warned, approaching again, now more threateningly. The other security guard soon followed him. He was prepared to make that humiliation with words become a very strong memory for Adam, something he wouldn't be able to forget quickly. But Adam, with his great experience in fights, wasn't afraid. He understood that the situation had gone beyond what was acceptable. He knew that the only solution was to give an answer that matched the problem. "You're making a mistake and I won't accept it," he said. His voice was strong, but full of feeling. Adam's gesture and words were not enough to stop the security guards. They were already determined to use their force. Suddenly, one of the men tried to grab Adam again. He did so with more force than before. It was at this moment that Adam's instinct to protect himself, which he had learned over many years in the army and the police, came to the fore. He quickly freed himself from the hands of the security guard, who wanted to hold him back. The group of people looked on, now more animated, talking amongst themselves. It seemed that the fight that was about to break out could not be avoided. Because of his long career, Adam decided to do something that would change everything. He quickly pulled out his gun. It was a pistol he still had with him to protect himself. It wasn't a threat. It was a way of showing that he wasn't there to be scared or dominated. The class, looking at the gun, naturally moved away. The silence ended when whispers and sounds of surprise began to emerge. The security guards stopped for a moment. Their faces showed a combination of surprise and fear. They hadn't thought that this man, who they thought was weak, could act so forcefully. But the tension in the room had not yet been resolved. It was a contest of strength, pride, and respect. Now, with a visible weapon, the situation was much worse. At that moment, fate appeared in a sad and violent way. A police car was passing nearby with its streetlights on. The policeman in the car, seeing the fight and Adam's gun, did something quickly. They didn't assess the situation. They didn't ask or try to understand what was going on. They immediately grabbed their weapons. Adam, who still had the pistol in his hand, couldn't act in time. The sound of gunfire spread through the street. It was a loud sound that he already knew, but at that moment, it felt like they were shooting at him for no reason. The bullets hit their target and Adam felt a sharp pain in his leg. The pain came quickly. It made him swerve and for a moment made him lose his footing. He fell again. This time he wasn't pushed by the security guards. He was knocked down by the bullets fired by the police. The ground was hard and cold. He received his bruised body. Even so, his head remained alert. He fought against the pain and confusion. He couldn't believe what had happened. The man who, for many years, had worked in the police and worn the uniform with respect and dignity, was now being persecuted by the same men who, in other situations, might have been his friends.
Time seemed to slow down as Adam lay on the ground. The sounds around him seemed far away. He heard the rapid footsteps of approaching policemen. However, he knew he was no longer fighting an enemy. As they approached him, guns raised, Adam shouted with all the strength he had, "I'm a retired police colonel." The discovery of who he really was surprised the police very much. They went limp, as if something heavy had fallen on them. The surprise on their faces was clear. They had just shot one of their own, without even bothering to ask what was going on. The confusion of the situation was over for a moment. That was replaced by the guilt and fear in the policeman's eyes. They didn't think twice. They rushed to help the person. They wanted to make up for the mistake they had made. "Colonel, we didn't know," one of the policemen said with difficulty, his voice full of fear. They helped Adam to his feet. Then they put him on a stretcher, which they had made simply. The people around them, who were agitated, looked on in silence. The system that Adam had helped for many years had tricked him. Even though he was injured, he wasn't going to let this betrayal go unreacted to. The people, who had previously looked on with great interest, now watched in total silence. They were surprised by the violent end to a scene that had begun with just an argument. Adam looked the policeman in the eye. His voice was hoarse, but firm. There was no fear there. There was only great disappointment. It was a sadness that many years of working in the public service had failed to remove. And then, without a second thought, he spoke the words that would change everything. "I am Colonel Adam, retired policeman, who used to be a colonel." The words hit the two policemen like a bomb. For an instant, everything around me seemed to stop. The officers' faces changed rapidly. They were surprised straight away. Then everything became confused and almost funny. The man they had shot, without thinking of any other course of action, was not a normal criminal. He wasn't just any man. He was a former policeman, a colonel. This person had spent many years of his life looking after the same streets where he now lay on the ground, hurt by those who should have been looking after him. The policeman's eyes opened wide in surprise. They looked at each other, unable to believe what they had just done. The younger of the two took a step back. The gun was still shaking in his hand. Fear and panic began to take over his head. The other, who knew better, quickly lowered his gun. It seemed that the gun in his hands had become dirty. He thought he should never have used it against that man. "Colonel, we didn't know," said one of the policemen in a shaky voice. He spoke slowly, almost haltingly. He felt the guilt wash over him. They came closer quickly. It seemed as if they were in a hurry to make amends and make what they had done disappear. But Adam, even though he was still on the ground, didn't look at them with compassion. He understood the police system better than anyone. He knew that, for many people, the color of their skin was seen as a danger. This happened no matter what their position, their history, or their achievements. The policeman, still confused, kneeled down next to Adam. They were trying to help Adam stand. The colonel, despite the severe pain in his leg, let them help him. But his gaze was cold and serious. "You didn't ask anything," he said, his voice calm, even though the pain was visible. "You shot first and asked questions later. Haven't you learned anything?" His words were like knives hurting the two men's minds. Now they were trying with all their might to fix what had happened. The policeman helped Adam to be placed carefully on a stretcher that had been made on the spot. Meanwhile, they called the ambulance quickly. The sound of sirens far away began to invade the room. However, the silence of the people there was very strong. The security guards, who had previously laughed arrogantly, were now standing still. Their faces were white and expressionless. They realized that they had started a series of things that had gotten completely out of hand. The pain in Adam's leg was still strong, but he held his head up. He was a man who, even when injured, didn't let injustice be ignored. He had been through difficult situations before, but this was different. It wasn't just a question of staying alive. It was about maintaining his dignity and his history. He knew he couldn't let what happened that day be forgotten or ignored. As the policeman tried to sort it out, one of them, a little confused, looked at Adam with eyes wide with fear. "Colonel, please. We didn't know it was you." His voice was almost a whisper. It sounded like he wanted to find some way to apologize and make himself feel better. But Adam, with a straight face, just said, "It wasn't about who I am. You didn't try to find out." Adam's words could be heard in the street. They had a sad wisdom. He understood that being a colonel, being a man in uniform, could, in the future, help him escape the worst consequences. What if he were a different person? What if he was a normal black man, with no degree, no job in the army to back him up? The truth was simple and stark. He was hit by a bullet not because of who he was, but because of what he symbolized. The color of his skin made those policemen see him as a threat. Time seemed to slow down as the ambulance arrived. Adam was carefully placed inside the ambulance. The paramedics worked quickly to stop the blood coming from his leg. As he was taken away, the police officers stood close by. They felt guilt and fear at the same time. They were aware that their professions and perhaps their lives were going to change forever. Adam was lying on the stretcher. He looked up at the sky as the ambulance door closed. The silence around him was very different from the chaos of ideas in his head. He understood that what had happened that day would not end there. The security guards and police officers would have to deal with the consequences of their actions. He wouldn't stop until justice happened. Going to hospital would only be the beginning of a long healing process. Adam, even though he was injured, was already beginning to plan his next steps. I knew that the pain in his body would pass soon, but the pain in the heart, the wound in the soul, would be harder to improve. When the ambulance arrived at the hospital, Adam was quickly taken to receive help. The pain in his leg was very strong, but he bore it without complaint. He showed the courage of someone who has been through much more difficult problems. The bright lights of the hospital, the noise of the machines, and the rapid movement of the surrounding nurses seemed a bit like background noise. What occupied his mind was what to do next. He had the evidence, he had the witnesses, and most importantly, he had the truth with him. While the doctors treated his wound, Adam stayed calm and strong. Every time they performed a procedure and every needle pierced his skin, it was nothing compared to the pain he felt inside. He knew that this event was not unique. How many other men, who are black like him, have not had the same opportunity to defend themselves? How many people have been silenced by violence and injustice without anyone caring? He wasn't going to let his case be just another one on the books. After a few hours of treatment, Adam was taken to a room. There he could rest for a while. But he couldn't rest. His thoughts were sharp and concentrated. Still in hospital, Adam did what had to be done. He spoke to his lawyers. He also sent messages to old friends he trusted in the police. Then he began to make his plan of action. The complaint would be made officially. The security guards would have to be punished for their racist and violent treatment. The police officers would also have to be held responsible for the carelessness and excessive use of force that almost cost him his life. However, the difficulties began to appear before the trial really began. The store where the incident took place, afraid of what people might think and the problems for its image, quickly took steps to hide any evidence that could blame the company. The security cameras inside the store, which could have filmed everything that happened between Adam and the security guards, were strangely erased, as if nothing had happened. It was a betrayal, but Adam wasn't sad. He understood that this would only be the beginning of the protective actions. He was a man who knew how to deal with difficult situations, and he had a plan. Adam knew a lot about the city center where it all happened. Did you know that, in addition to the cameras inside the store, there were also several others on the street and in nearby stores that could have filmed what happened outside? Every movement and every detail of the event was now recorded on cameras that weren't in the store. Adam would use this information to his advantage. In the lawyer's office, the two began to plan their strategy. The photos taken by these cameras were very important. They would clearly show the order of events. First, the security guards annoyed and pushed Adam. Then he was publicly humiliated. Then he reacted in defense by reaching for his gun. Finally, the police arrived and, without asking any questions, shot an innocent man. Adam understood that those photos had a power that no words could have. The next step was to make the complaints against the security guards and police officers who took part more official. Adam's lawyer carefully wrote down each part and each accusation. He made sure that all the details of what happened were shown clearly. The security guards would be held responsible not only for hitting someone, but also for treating Adam unequally because of his race. This could be seen not only from the arguments they had, but also from the men's behavior.
They felt that just because Adam was a black man, he didn't have the right to be in that place, to defend himself, or to have things that have value. The accusations against the police were clear: excessive force, dangerous shooting, and wrong behavior. Adam knew it wouldn't be easy to put the blame on his former colleagues, but he couldn't let what had happened have no consequences. He didn't just see them as police officers. He saw them as people in a system that, for too long, hadn't helped people like him. He thought that justice couldn't choose between colors or clothes. Everyone had to take care of what they did. Preparation for the hearing began straight away. Adam's lawyer spoke to the owners of the nearby stores. He officially requested the recordings from the security cameras. Some stores were afraid at first. They didn't want to get involved in such a complicated matter. But the fame and background of Adam, who was a police colonel and is now retired, helped open up opportunities that might not otherwise have existed. The owners realized that Adam didn't just want revenge, but that he wanted justice. So they gave him the images without hesitation. With the documents in hand, the lawyer began to mount Adam's defense. The photos showed well that he had been offended, embarrassed, and attacked before doing anything. They also showed that the security guards had acted with indifference and racism. They pushed the person and treated him with disrespect. The way the police officers acted was even more worrying. The video clearly showed that they fired before looking at the situation. They fired at a man who was not a real danger at the time. The day of the trial was set. Adam prepared for the fight. He had fought in many places during his life, but this was sure to be one of the toughest. He wasn't just fighting for his dignity. He was fighting for all the people who, like him, had already suffered from a system that refused to see them as equals. The important day had arrived. The courtroom was full. People were anxious. The courtroom doors opened to begin a trial. This trial involved security guards and police officers. It also talked about serious issues of racism and abuse of power. In this place, everyone was looking at him. The press, the people who were interested, and even the defendants themselves looked at Adam. They were trying to understand how he had managed to face so many difficulties and still stand firm. The security guards, Miles and Gregory, were sitting with worried faces. Anxiety showed in their movements. They understood that they weren't just being judged for what had happened to Adam. They were also being judged for the racist and disrespectful way they had shown themselves in public. Next to Jason and Patrick, the policeman who had shot Adam stood with a firm posture. But it was clear that they were worried. For them, it had started out as an ordinary conversational situation. But their carelessness and misconceptions about others had turned out to be very serious problems. Now they were there, without the uniform that protected them. They were defendants and were going to face the consequences of their actions. Judge Cooper, a dark-skinned man, looked carefully at the papers in front of him. He was a symbol of justice. However, he also understood that this case was more important than usual. Cooper knew what it was like to be a black man in a position of power. He felt very strongly about what was at stake. He also knew that some people were going to challenge his decision. They would say he was being unfair, but that didn't scare him. He wouldn't make judgments based on skin color. He would analyze the truth of the events that happened in front of him. The hearing began with Adam giving his testimony. He recounted, in detail, everything that happened on that bad day. He spoke from the moment the security guards came up to him until the moment the police shot him. His voice was strong and calm. It showed an authority that seemed natural. Every word had a weight in the air, and the courtroom was completely quiet as he spoke. It wasn't just a story. It was the difficult truth of a man who, even though he had helped the police all his life, was seen as a dangerous suspect because of his color. Then they showed the evidence that could be seen. The photos from the security cameras clearly showed Miles and Gregory laughing and joking with Adam. They pushed him and treated him badly. There was no denying what was in front of everyone. Adam fell to the ground. He only reacted when he felt that his dignity had been lost. The photos also showed when the police, Jason and Patrick, arrived. They didn't think twice. They took out their guns and shot at him before he understood what was happening. The security guards, when they saw the images on the screen, lowered their heads. They knew there was no escape. The evidence was strong. The policemen had serious faces, but their tension showed that they felt guilt. That guilt was now clear, and they couldn't deny it. They had failed in their duty to protect and help. Now, in that instant, They were about to face the results. Adam's lawyer laid out his case very clearly and in great detail. It wasn't just an isolated case of discrimination. It was an ongoing practice. This practice meant that black men were always viewed with suspicion. Adam was a colonel who had retired. He was a man who had spent his life working for the public. But that day, people didn't see him that way. He was seen as a kind of person, and that, more than anything else, was what the court needed to evaluate. After the testimonies and the presentation of the evidence, Judge Cooper paused for a moment before giving his decision. Nothing could be heard in the room. Everyone there knew that this was a very important moment. Cooper, with his serious manner, began to say something. He emphasized that justice must be equal for everyone, regardless of race, class, or social position. All people, no matter where they come from, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. He stressed that what happened to Adam was wrong. He said that those who used their power and position badly needed to be punished. The sentence was direct. The security guards, Miles and Gregory, received a 2-year prison sentence and a fine of $30,000 each. They were punished for assault and racial discrimination. They had started a series of events that almost killed an innocent man. Now they would pay for the things they had done. The reaction to the decision was clear on the faces of the two men. They thought they could get off scot-free until that moment. For police officers Jason and Patrick, the punishment was even harsher. They lost their jobs and were sent to prison for 3 years. The reason was abuse of power and disproportionate use of force. The trust the public had in them was broken. The court couldn't help but notice this. Justice finally won. The two men who once wore the clothes of the law to defend will now wear those clothes as defendants. As the sentence was read out, the courtroom went quiet for a moment. People realized the seriousness of the situation. For Jason and Patrick, who were the convicted police officers, and Miles and Gregory, who were the security guards who suffered humiliation, the sentence was not the end. For them, that conviction meant much more than just a punishment from justice. It was a betrayal and a pain that would not heal easily. They didn't think justice was a fair solution for Adam. For them, they were punished in the wrong way by a system that, at the time, they believed was bad because of its support for certain races. He only won because he looks like the judge, Jason said, his voice full of anger. He couldn't see justice, only the color of Adam and Judge Cooper's skin. Patrick, who hadn't spoken until then, nodded. That was a plan from the start. We didn't have a chance. The two policemen were in their uniforms, but they no longer had the honor they had before. They could feel the anger burning inside them. They had lost their places and their honor. In their minds, there was only one explanation: the reverse racism they thought they had experienced. "It won't stay that way," said Gregory, anger in his voice. "He put us here and let us down, but we're not going to end up alone." The idea of revenge began to grow inside the 4 men who were together. What had started out as a trial now became a matter of hurt pride and growing anger for them. It wasn't just Adam who was the target of their anger. Judge Cooper was the person who gave the ruling. He did it, and people thought he had convicted the defendants not because of what they had done, but because he and Adam had the same skin color. The 4 of them looked at each other. They were creating a kind of wordless agreement at that moment. The ideas of revenge had been put away. Now, all they needed was the right moment to do something. It wouldn't be just any revenge. They wanted something that was more than just physical force. They wanted to put an end to Adam and Cooper, not just by using force, but also with the malice of someone who had suffered a lot and now wanted to make others suffer too. Jason, with his experience and understanding of police systems, began to draw the first pictures of the plan. "Let's start with the judge," he said, his eyes cold and intent. "He's very important. If we catch him, Adam will look very bad. We need to do this in such a way that they understand what it's like to lose everything. They need to feel what it's like to be devastated inside." Jason's anger and experience in operations made him the leader of the group. Patrick, who always acted more quickly, accepted straight away. "Angelina," he said, with a wicked grin. "The judge's wife. If we catch her, he'll do whatever we want." The plan was beginning to take shape. Kidnap Angelina, Judge Cooper's pregnant wife, and use her to demand a very high ransom. In addition, they wanted to shake up the judge, who they thought had helped Adam in the wrong way. They knew that Cooper would do anything to help his wife and the child she was expecting.
It was a planned, emotionless coup for the conspirators. It would be the beginning of their revenge.
But Adam was also a target. For him, the plan would be much tougher. It wasn't enough just to hurt him in the body. They wanted to leave him alone, unprotected and ashamed, just as they felt at that moment. "What about Adam?" asked Miles, anger in his eyes. Jason, once again the leader, answered calmly. "Adam will have a high cost, but not in this place. We'll take him and leave him on a desert island, far away from everything. He'll pass away slowly, without company, no respect, no value." The park was very quiet that morning. It was a place she went to often. She knew the most hidden places and liked to walk in silence. She kept thinking her own thoughts. Pregnancy made you feel complete, but sometimes it also made you tired. The walks helped to ease the tension. As Angelina walked along one of the park's quiet paths, she began to feel a certain alertness in her body. Maybe it was intuition, that voice inside us that sometimes tries to warn us of an approaching danger. She looked around, but everything seemed normal. The silence, however, was getting too heavy. The steps, which had once been light, were now more uncertain. Angelina didn't know it, but Jason and Patrick had been watching her for weeks. They knew every move and every activity. They had chosen that moment very carefully. The trap was about to begin. The attack came unexpectedly. It was very fast and caused great destruction. Jason and Patrick, wearing normal running clothes, approached from the sides of the path. In a few seconds, Angelina's calm face changed to total despair. A strong, rough hand covered her mouth, making her unable to scream. Her heart beat fast. Fear surrounded her in a way she had never felt before. She tried to fight back, but her health and the surprise made her weak. The men's strength was too great. Before long, Angelina was pulled off the trail. Her screams spread through the silence of the park, but there was no one around to hear her. His eyes were wide with fear. He looked around for help, but only saw the cruel indifference of the kidnappers. Patrick, his face almost hidden, looked into her eyes. The strength of his gaze made Angelina understand that this wasn't just a robbery. It was something much bigger, something intimate. Jason and Patrick pulled the person to a car that was parked further away from the park, where no one could see. Angelina tried not to give in, but she was tired. This was because of her pregnancy and the scare she'd had. In the back seat of the car, Angelina had her mouth taped shut. She could feel the sadness building up inside her. She was not only afraid for her life, but also for the baby she was expecting. Her body was shaking. It wasn't just the violence of what was happening. It was also the fear of thinking that something could happen to her child. As the car left the park, the once calm and familiar place began to disappear. This gave way to a journey full of doubts. Jason and Patrick's revenge plan was in progress. They knew that Judge Cooper, a respected and important man, would do anything to help his wife. And that's exactly what they wanted, to see him fall, overcome by fear, asking for help. For these people, it wasn't just a question of money. The request for $1 million they wanted was only part of the plan. The real aim was to destroy the judge's life. They wanted to take away everything that was most important to him. The journey to the place where Angelina was being held was quiet. All that could be heard were the low sounds of her unsuccessfully trying to free herself from the ropes that bound her. She was very scared, but tried to stay calm for the sake of her son. "Did you know that if you let fear take over, you can lose control?" She thought of Cooper. The hope that he could save her was the only thing that kept her strong. Angelina knew Cooper's strength of will. However, she didn't know that, at that moment, he was still unaware of the big problem that was about to begin. The prison was an empty house near the city. It was a remote place where no one would think to look. When they arrived, Angelina was taken inside. She entered a small, windowless room. The light in the room was dim and came from a lamp. The people who had arrested her had left her tied to a chair. In the heavy silence of that room, she realized the seriousness of her situation. She had no one to help her. There was no one to hear her cries. She was alone, surrounded by enemies who could not be seen. She didn't know what the future held for her or her son. Meanwhile, Cooper still hadn't heard the news about Angelina's disappearance. He was at home. He thought his wife was enjoying another quiet morning in the park. He didn't know that his family's safety was about to end. The phone he always left by his side suddenly vibrated. This opened up a space for noise in the quiet of the morning. Cooper answered the call slowly. He didn't know that this call was going to change everything. The person on the other end of the line had a cold voice and seemed to think long and hard before speaking. She was direct and said, "We have your wife, Judge, and the child she's expecting. If you want to see them alive, you'll have to give us $1 million. And don't even think about calling the police. If you do that, you'll never see Angelina again." Cooper stood still and didn't move. His hands were shaking and his breathing stopped for a moment. What he had just heard had hit him like a huge wave. Your head became very nervous, and the ground beneath you seemed to disappear. "Angelina?" he said with difficulty, unable to believe what was happening. The voice on the other end of the call was still emotionless, with no sign of compassion. "You have 2 days, Judge. Don't make any mistakes. And don't forget, no police." The cell phone slipped out of Cooper's hands. He had no reaction. He couldn't understand what was happening in front of him. His wife, Angelina, who was expecting his child, had been kidnapped. He was a righteous man. He was exposed to criminals who wanted revenge. Cooper, who had spent a lifetime judging others, was now on trial himself. The penalty of this trial could cost the lives of his family. The next few hours would be very difficult for Cooper. He understood that he couldn't pay the ransom just like that, but he also didn't want to put the lives of his wife and son at risk. He felt trapped between what he had to do and despair. Every second that passed hurt his heart. The fear of losing everything I loved most was too strong. Elsewhere, Angelina, who was still trapped, didn't know that her husband was racing against time to save them both. Jason and Patrick's evil plan was happening. For them, every minute of Cooper's pain and suffering was a victory. The first attack had already been made. They thought that, soon, the judge would get down on his knees and do what they wanted. While Angelina was locked up and tied up in one place, the second act of Jason, Patrick, Miles, and Gregory's cruel vengeance continued unabated. That same evening, when it was dark in the city and the quiet streets seemed calm, Adam, in his home, was about to go through the most difficult moment of his life. Adam was home alone. He was still healing from the emotional and physical wounds he had sustained in the previous incident. His days were calm. He was far from the confusion of the battles before. His body wasn't as fast as it used to be. The bruise on his leg still reminded him of what had happened. He thought that, after the trial, he would be able to live peacefully. He didn't know that revenge was around the corner, waiting for the right time to act. Miles and Gregory, the security guards who had promised revenge, watched Adam's house calmly. Did you know he lived alone? He thought the best time to do something was at night. At that time, the city was asleep and there was little security. They had planned everything carefully. They were counting on Adam's surprise and weakness. What they wanted was more than just revenge. They wanted to tear him apart from the inside, making him feel despair and powerlessness. Adam's fate would not be a quick and violent death. His fate would be abandonment and suffering alone. The moment came. In the middle of the night, when Adam was already asleep, Miles and Gregory began to put the plan into practice. With tools to open the house quietly, they approached without making a sound. Adam was lying on his bed and was almost asleep. Suddenly, he woke up to a strange noise coming from the living room. His instincts as a retired policeman were still good. He realized at that moment that something wasn't right. He got up slowly, using his injured leg for support, and walked towards the noise. But before she could reach the door was thrown wide open. 2 men in masks entered very quickly. Miles and Gregory, full of rage and desire for revenge, went after Adam. Even though he was older and his body was tired, Adam tried to fight back. His protective instincts were still there. But the pain in his leg and the strength of his attackers meant that any attempt to fight was in vain. They caught him quickly. They bound his hands and feet with leather straps. They also put a cloth over his mouth so that he couldn't scream. The fear in Adam's eyes was clear. He had faced many enemies during his life, but he had never imagined being attacked like this, inside his own home. "You thought you'd won, didn't you?" Miles said quietly into Adam's ear, his voice full of disdain. "But now you're going to suffer the consequences of what you did to us. Let's see how strong you are when you're alone, with no one around." Adam was trapped and unable to defend himself. He was pulled out of his house, his feet dragging on the icy ground. His heart was beating irregularly in his chest. However, he couldn't do anything, Just watch without being able to act on what was happening. Miles and Gregory put him in a black car that had no license plates. The car was ready to take him to the final place, an empty island in the middle of the sea. The idea was easy, but very hard. They would leave Adam there. He wouldn't be able to communicate. He would also lack food and other necessities. He would be exposed to the weather and nature. For these people, the worst punishment they could give him was not to die soon, but to die slowly and alone. In this situation, his dignity and his life were slowly disappearing. The car sped through the deserted streets of the city. It was heading away, towards a place by the sea where a boat was waiting for them. Adam was completely silent. He had many thoughts and was afraid. What was going on? Why were they doing this to him? He couldn't believe that, after everything he'd been through, his life was once again full of confusion and pain. He thought of his son, Hudson. He wondered if he would ever have the chance to see the boy again. As the car drove towards the beach, Adam began to feel that his end was coming. He had spent his whole life fighting for justice and honor. Now, he was almost being cast aside, as if his life had no value. Fate seemed very harsh, and Adam, his mouth covered, tried to control his thoughts. He tried hard not to let the fear take hold of him. They arrived at the agreed place. A small boat was waiting for them. Miles and Gregory pulled Adam out of the car without saying a word. They put Adam into the vehicle. The sea was dark and there was no end in sight. The thought of being alone on an island with no one left Adam with a fear he had never felt before. He wasn't just afraid of loneliness. He was also afraid of dying there and being forgotten by everyone. The boat started out into the great ocean, and every minute seemed to last a long time for Adam. His future was already decided. His promise to take revenge on Miles and Gregory was about to come true, but what they didn't know was that Adam's son, called Hudson, had taken a step that would totally change the way things turned out. Hudson is a police lieutenant. He had always wanted to protect his father. Hudson knew that Adam could be at risk after the trial. That's why he put a tracker in Adam's father's car. This small device would turn on if Adam left town unannounced. That night, while Hudson was asleep, the silent warning buzzed on his cell phone. The young lieutenant woke up suddenly. He sensed that something wasn't right. Hudson, still sleepy, looked at the screen of his cell phone. The device he had hidden in his father's car was on, a warning that, in other situations, might be overlooked, but that night seemed special. Fear began to creep into his heart. He knew who his father was. Adam was not someone who usually left home unannounced. This was even more true at that time of night. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Hudson sat up quickly in bed. He opened the map and was startled to see that his father's car was heading towards the beach, away from the city, along a route he had never seen before. It was as if Adam was leaving the safety of home. He was going somewhere that Hudson still couldn't understand. But somehow Hudson knew it wasn't a good thing. His fingers trembled as he glanced quickly at the details of the route. His heart was beating fast, thinking that his father was at risk. Hudson picked up the phone and started calling his bosses and friends in the police. His voice was strong, but it showed that he was in a hurry. "I want every unit you have, now," he ordered, leaving no room for questions. He spoke briefly about the situation. He said that his father was missing and that the car's tracker showed a dangerous place. The police, knowing the respect Adam always had among his friends at work, acted quickly. Police cars were dispatched. Helicopters were ready to fly over the coastal area. The rescue action was underway. While preparing the operation, Hudson couldn't get the image of his father out of his head. He knew that Adam was weak. Still healing from the emotional and physical wounds of the trial, his father couldn't defend himself without help. The memory of the trial and the promise of revenge made by Jason, Patrick, Miles, and Gregory appeared in Hudson's head like a strong wave. He understood that they could do anything. Now his father's future was in their hands. The police began to follow the signal from the locator. The police cars sped through the empty city streets. They broke the silence of the night with the sirens that could be heard on the corners and in the streets. Hudson, with the map open on the dashboard of the police car, watched every change in the signal. He knew he was getting closer to his father. But there was one thing he couldn't imagine: the complete darkness that was coming, the endless sea that could take his father away forever. The policeman, well organized, chose a spot on the beach. The sign showed that Adam's car was close to the sea. Hudson knew that they had to act quickly and with precision. He understood that any mistake could cost his father his life. When they reached the place, a small pier that was abandoned, the lights of the cars brightened the darkness of the night. Adam's car was no longer there, but the tracker's signal was still very strong. A boat is a type of watercraft. It is used to transport people and things. Many people like to go boating or fishing. There are different types of boats, such as small ones, which travel on rivers, and large ones, which travel on oceans. Boats can be powered by oars, engines, or sails. They took their father out in a boat. Hudson quickly called the police who work at sea. Helicopters were flying over the coast. They tried to find signs of boats that looked strange. The adrenaline was running high inside him, and time seemed to slow down as he waited for a response from the helicopter pilots. "We have to find them before they reach the deep sea," thought Hudson. He knew that if they reached deep water, it would be very difficult to rescue Adam. The car's radio made a noise, and the voice of the man in the helicopter brought hope. "We see a strange boat about 2 kilometers from the beach, heading south. Let's get them." Hudson's heart beat faster. They were close, very close. Now everything depended on the speed of the police in getting to that boat before Miles and Gregory's revenge plan was finalized. The patrols at sea began to move. The lights of the boats illuminated the darkness of the sea. They were looking for any sign of the boat carrying Adam. Meanwhile, on the kidnapper's boat, Adam was trapped and unable to move. His mouth was covered and he could only hear the noise of the sea around him. He was aware that he was being taken far away, to a dark place. The loneliness was beginning to affect him. Adam thought for a moment that perhaps this was the end. But what he didn't know was that his son, Hudson, was closer to him than he could have imagined. The hunt at sea was intense. Police lights began to shine on the distant horizon, coming fast close to the boat. Miles and Gregory, realizing they were being followed, tried to make the boat go faster, but it was too late. The police boats surrounded them in a very organized way. They prevented any exit. The revenge they had carefully planned was going down the drain in front of them. "Give yourselves up! You can't get out!" the officers shouted over the loudspeakers as the police boats came closer. Miles and Gregory had no choice but to fight, but they knew they were losing the fight. The police arrived at the boat quickly and arrested the people before they could do anything else. Hudson, in one of the boats, was the first to jump into the boat where his father was being held. His heart was beating fast. He looked closely at the person trapped on the ground. When Hudson got close to Adam, he became very emotional and released his father. The relief he felt was great. Adam was tired and weak. He looked into his son's eyes. For an instant, he saw all the sacrifice and love his son had given so that he could be saved. "Daddy, you're safe. I'm here," said Hudson, his voice full of emotion. Adam was tired and couldn't answer right away, but his eyes, full of gratitude and pride, showed everything. The rescue had been a success. Hudson, with his willpower and intelligence, managed to pull his father back from the brink of death. Miles and Gregory were captured and taken to the police station. As the night began to draw to a close, Adam was taken back to the beach, where the doctors would take care of him. The nightmare, at least for the time being, was over. But the conquest was not complete. Hudson knew that the people behind the kidnapping, Jason and Patrick, who had been police officers before, were still at large. The search for justice wasn't over yet. The police began to think about how to catch the men who were behind the whole evil plan. When they arrived at the beach, Adam was taken to a hospital. He was to undergo an assessment with the doctors after what had happened the night before. Hudson, however, didn't stop working. He knew that every second was very important. He worked with his police friends on the next part, an action to find and arrest Jason and Patrick. During the interrogation, Miles and Gregory, being pressured by the cops and realizing that they had no way out, ended up confessing. They said that Jason and Patrick had an escape plan ready. Did you know that if something went wrong, the 2 former police officers planned to flee the country? Their final destination would be Vietnam, a place where they could escape the authorities and start their lives anew, far from the justice that was seeking them. With the confessions in hand, the police now had the information they needed to find the 2 men. Hudson, determined not to let the culprits get away, quickly called in his team. They knew that Jason and Patrick were thinking of escaping through the airport. They also knew that time was of the essence. If they managed to get through the security check and onto the plane, catching them would be much more difficult. The seriousness of the situation meant that every police officer working on the operation was very vigilant.
The airport, which was already filling up with people for the first flights of the morning, became the place to search. Hudson and his team soon arrived. They were disguised among the travelers. They watched every move carefully. They had an exact description of Jason and Patrick. They knew that the two would try to escape without attracting attention. The police's plan was easy. They wanted to catch the people before they reached the boarding gate. While the officers walked through the terminal, Hudson was in direct contact with his intelligence team. They watched the airport's security cameras. Every face was watched. Every move was watched carefully. The nervousness was clear, but the desire to catch Jason and Patrick was even greater. The two men thought they could get away without punishment. However, Hudson knew that justice would come to them. Suddenly, a message came over the radio. "We found them both. They're heading for the entrance to the international flight." Hudson's heart beat faster. It was the most important moment. Carefully, he and his team began to walk silently towards the gate that had been indicated. Jason and Patrick were close to escaping. They carried backpacks and wore simple clothes. They believed they had already gotten away from the danger. But just as they were about to pass through the final checkpoint for boarding, the police acted. Hudson and his team surrounded the two men quickly and efficiently. They gave the men no chance to react. "The police are here. You're under arrest," shouted Hudson. He spoke with firmness and authority. His voice stopped the surrounding conversations. Jason and Patrick were taken by surprise. They couldn't react in time. Their surprised reactions showed that they didn't think they would be caught so quickly. The policeman put handcuffs on the two ex-policemen on the spot. The crowd at the airport, which was confused at first, began to look on with interest. Jason and Patrick were held down and taken away quietly. The attempt to escape hadn't worked. Now, finally, they would have to deal with the consequences of their wrongdoing. Hudson watched the two men being led out of the terminal. He felt a sense of relief and a strong desire to act. He knew that justice had won. However, he also understood that his family's battle, especially his father's, would still leave deep scars. As the police took Jason and Patrick to the cars waiting outside the airport, Hudson stopped for a moment to think. The cruel revenge the two had organized hadn't worked. But the feelings from last night were still there. Angelina, who is Judge Cooper's wife, was still in captivity. Adam, even though he had been rescued, had been through a very difficult experience. He had a lot of work ahead of him, but at that moment, catching Jason and Patrick was a great achievement. When they got back to the police station, Jason and Patrick were officially charged with kidnapping, planning a crime, and trying to kill someone. The evidence was very strong. With Miles and Gregory also in prison, their revenge plan had totally failed. Judge Cooper, who was still saddened by Angelina's kidnapping, learned of the arrest of the two men. He was relieved, but also anxious. He understood that the fight for his wife's life was not yet over. Hudson, with a calmer mind, went to the hospital to visit his father. When he entered Adam's room, he saw that he was lying with his eyes open. He was still thinking about everything that had happened. When the two of them looked at each other, they didn't need to say anything. The silence between father and son held a lot of emotion. Hudson knew that he had helped save his father. Adam, even though he was in pain, knew that his son's love and courage had been fundamental in keeping him alive. The police questioners began with clear, objective questions, without beating around the bush. They understood that Jason and Patrick were weak, both in body and mind, after the race and the arrest. The evidence against them was very strong, but there were still some important parts missing, mainly about Angelina's kidnapping. It was important to get the truth out. They needed to make sure that nothing remained hidden. Patrick, very distressed and without faith, began to tell how, after the trial, Jason's anger and hatred, together with Miles and Gregory's feelings of shame, made them plan revenge against Adam and Judge Cooper. He said that at first, the plan seemed easy. The idea was to get Angelina and Adam to leave Cooper insecure. They wanted to make Cooper suffer for the punishment they felt was unjust. Miles and Gregory's plan was to leave Adam on a desert island so that he would die little by little. To the group, this seemed like a poetic punishment. They thought this idea mixed physical pain with emotional suffering. The kidnapping of Angelina, Cooper's pregnant wife, had a much crueler purpose. They understood that Cooper would do anything to protect his wife and child. They wanted to see Cooper sad and helpless.
"She was his weakness," said Patrick, his voice getting stronger as he spoke. "The judge is the person who decides cases in court. He listens to the evidence and gives his opinion. It's the judge who says what should be done according to the law. We knew he would do anything for her. The intention was to get Angelina and ask for money in return. But in reality, what we wanted was to see everything destroyed. We wanted him to feel pain." The details of the plan came out one by one. As Patrick spoke, Jason, who had been silent until that moment, began to get angry. He looked at Patrick with disdain. He saw that his friend was telling him everything. Jason spoke up, as he felt he was almost losing control of the situation. "Keep quiet, Patrick!" he shouted, his voice full of anger. But it was too late. The doors to the truth were already open, and there was no going back.
The questioners continued to insist. Did you know that the solution to helping Angelina was right there, in that room? They needed to find out where she was before it was too late. "Where's Angelina?" asked one of the men asking the questions, his voice full of haste. Time was very important. They knew that her health and that of the baby were in danger. Patrick was afraid and in doubt. He looked at Jason, who was keeping his mouth shut, but knew he couldn't hide it any longer. "She's in a house. It's an empty house on the side of town," he said, looking elsewhere. "That's where we were going to keep her until we got the money. We didn't want to hurt her. We just wanted to make the rescue." Hudson, on the other side of the glass, closed his eyes for a moment. Angelina finally had a place to stay, and that brought him great joy. But he knew that danger still existed. The rescue work had to be quick and certain. He couldn't risk wasting any more time. He left the observation room without a second thought. He then set about directing the next part of the mission with his team. Patrick's confession and the information that came from the interrogations showed where Angelina was. What's more, this information put an end to the revenge plan that had been carefully put together. Now everything was clear. The hatred, envy, and desire for power that drove Jason and Patrick were on display, and there was no escape. They would be charged for everything they did. It was time to catch the people who were really responsible for the evil plan of revenge. Patrick's confession showed where Angelina, who is Judge Cooper's wife, was. The operation to rescue her was about to begin. Hudson, with great determination, led the special operations team. He knew that every minute was important to save Angelina and her son. He felt a rush of adrenaline as he and his team sped towards the empty house near the city. This was the place where Angelina was being held. The police car passed through the empty streets very quickly. It broke the early morning silence with sirens and flashing lights. Inside the cars, the mood was serious but focused. Hudson, driving one of the cars, felt a heavy responsibility on his shoulders. He had saved his father, Adam, but now he had to ensure that Angelina, an innocent, pregnant woman, was freed from her kidnappers. Every choice and every step he took would be very important to the success of the mission. When they arrived at the empty house, the police cars turned off their lights. The officers moved quietly and took important places around the building. The building was in a bad state. The windows were broken and the walls had moss on them. This showed that the place was abandoned and sad. The plan was easy. Strike quickly and quietly. That way, they could take the kidnappers by surprise and get Angelina to safety. Hudson spoke the last commands to the team. He used words with a lot of force, but also with haste. "She's inside the house. No mistakes can be made." With a signal from Hudson, the group moved on. Entering the house was quick and easy. The policemen carefully broke down the door, and in a few seconds they were inside. The place inside was dark. There was only a dim light illuminating the hallway. Hudson's eyes got used to the darkness. He led the group down the corridor towards the small room where Angelina was being held. The kidnappers had been taken by surprise. They had no time to act. The police soon managed to arrest the two men who were inside the house. They were pinned to the floor, and their attempts to resist were soon stopped. Meanwhile, Hudson made his way down the corridor to Angelina's bedroom. He quickly opened the door. In the shadows, he saw Angelina, who was very thin. She was sitting on a chair, tied up, and her eyes were full of fear. Hudson ran over to her. His hands were shaking slightly as he untied the ropes that were attached to her wrists and ankles. Angelina, with a worried face, looked at him with eyes full of gratitude and calm, but also tiredness. "You're safe now," Hudson said in a calm voice, trying to soothe her. "Angelina,
even without strength, held his hand, and tears fell from her face. The good feeling of finally being safe and knowing that her baby was okay was very strong. The police began transporting Angelina out of the house. An ambulance was already waiting to take her to hospital. The pressure in the air was decreasing, and the success of the job of saving people was clear. Angelina was protected. Hudson felt the last few hours weighing on him, but at the same time, he felt a great sense of relief. He had done what needed to be done. She felt reassured. But Hudson's work wasn't over yet. When Angelina returned to the police station, she received medical attention. Her husband, Cooper, learned that she had been rescued well. Meanwhile, justice was closing in on Jason, Patrick, Miles, and Gregory. All the people in the revenge story were now being looked after by the police. The confessions, evidence, and testimony were creating a strong case. The trial was about to begin. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was full of tension. The case of Jason, Patrick, Miles, and Gregory, the four men who had planned a very bad revenge against Adam and Judge Cooper, was close to being over. The prosecutors began their final speech, and each word seemed to get heavier for the defendants. They retold the story of the events that made the trial happen. They explained how Jason and Patrick, filled with hatred and anger after being punished for doing wrong in power, decided to take revenge. They, along with Miles and Gregory, took Adam and Angelina without permission. They did this by putting these people's lives in danger. This happened because of revenge and evil.
These men, the prosecutor began in a strong voice, not only tried to end the life of a retired colonel who worked hard for the public, but they also kidnapped a woman who is expecting a baby, putting her life and that of her child at risk. Their actions were planned, very bad, and came from a desire to take revenge that is not acceptable in a society that seeks to be civilized. They thought up and carried out a kidnapping to cause pain and suffering. In Adam's case, they wanted him to die slowly and alone. The evidence was shown again. The messages from Patrick, the evidence that Jason was responsible for the plan, and the security camera footage that showed what the defendants did on the day of the kidnappings. There was no denying that they were involved. It was all out in the open, and their attempts to defend themselves were no longer working. Jason and Patrick, who once saw themselves as people harmed by a system that, according to them, helped Adam and Judge Cooper, were now facing the truth about their decisions. When it was the defense lawyer's turn to speak, they tried unsuccessfully to say that the defendants did everything on impulse, driven by emotion after the trial that took place earlier. The court already believed that the reason for what those men did was not a spur of the moment, but a planned, emotionless revenge. They had the chance to think, make plans, and act. Yet they decided to follow the path of violence and hatred. Finally, the judge spoke. There was almost complete silence in the room. Everyone looked at him, waiting for the decision that would end this difficult moment. The judge, with a strong and serious voice, began to give his decision. This court has looked at all the evidence and listened to the reports. What has become clear throughout this process is that the accused acted intentionally. They wanted to cause serious harm to the victims. They made plans and carried out 2 kidnappings. One of the kidnappings involved a pregnant woman. This put her and her baby's life in danger. You did your actions because you wanted revenge, without thinking about the lives that were in danger. He paused for a moment, making his words louder in the room. Because of the crimes of kidnapping, collaboration in crime, and attempted murder, this court gives a sentence of 20 years in prison to Jason, Patrick, Miles, and Gregory. They will not be able to leave prison for the first 10 years. Their actions were done out of malice and evil intent. This court feels that justice must be done. When they heard the sentence, the defendants showed no reaction at the time. Jason, who had masterminded the plan, stood still, as if he had already known that this was going to happen. Patrick, who had talked about everything in his conversation with the police, bowed his head in acceptance. Miles and Gregory, who were responsible for Adam's kidnapping, were clearly worried. They understood that what they had done had led them into a no-win situation. As the accused were led out of the room with their hands bound, everyone there felt relief. Adam felt that justice had finally happened. He still bore the marks of the kidnapping, but that didn't diminish his sense of relief. Angelina, together with Cooper, held her belly and, with tear-filled eyes, knew that her and her baby's future was protected. Hudson, who was the hero of this story, had saved his father and Angelina. He was silent, but he felt very proud.
He did what he should as a policeman and as a son. He took care to ensure that the guilty were punished. The cycle of revenge and suffering had come to an end. Now everyone could start again.